Robert Carnworth, ex-Supreme Court Justice of the UK. I'm grateful to Christoph asking me to join this event. I'm here under slightly false pretenses because the blurb I was sent to say I'm chairing it, but I think in practice Christoph's going to do most of the work of actually introducing the speakers. My interest is that I'm trying to help coordinate the legal work going into COP26, because I think there's a big opportunity with this country, UK, leading the COP26 conference in Glasgow next year to try and put the law and legal issues at the heart of the discussion and to develop a program of legal events and to explore the many different ways in which the law and lawyers can actually assist the process of challenging climate change. I've actually just been listening to the UK Climate Change Committee's presentation of its sixth budget, which is its recommendations for government here for the sixth period in 2033 to 37. And it's a very remarkable document they produced. But I think what it does show is what can be done within a strong legal framework, which we have here in the UK in the Climate Change Act 2008. And I hope that if the government lives up to its promises and adopts that, then that will provide a very good basis for showing to the rest of the world what can be achieved and how the law can help to achieve it. But I was very pleased to hear from Christoph about the work of LRI in sort of particularly in assisting developing countries with advice on how they can make their own contributions and prepare for climate change. There's a lot of very interesting work. And so when he asked me to join this session, I really looked forward to hearing different submissions from a range of speakers from around the world as what they think lawyers can do. And so, I mean, I can see a number of faces that I recognize on the panel, but some I don't. So I think without more ado, I shall hand back to Christoph and ask him to get the proceedings underway. And I'll be listening with great interest to what you have to tell us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert. And thank you all for joining us. The process is pretty straightforward. We will go around the world and hear from lawyers. At the moment, there are 12 on my list of speakers. You will all have 3 minutes, and after 2.5 minutes, I will raise my yellow card and you will hear this sound. And then after 3 minutes, it'll be the red card. And after 3 minutes and 15 seconds, the system will automatically mute you. I apologize if it comes to that. I know it's terribly rude. So try to be as focused as possible. Before you speak, that's important. Please put on your camera and unmute yourself. You're all muted at the moment, so you need to unmute yourself. And I would like to start this journey in one of the most climate vulnerable countries of the world, in Bangladesh. Sharaban Tahura Zaman teaches at one of the universities in Dhaka. She supports the group of least developed countries, the LDCs, during the negotiations, and is the member of the Center for Climate Justice in Bangladesh. Shara, you have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Christoph, and very good evening to all of you from Dhaka. So it's my pleasure to join in this session. So I would like to actually briefly talk upon on the issue of NDC and how we can promote the compliance of NDC. So in this forum, actually, we are celebrating the 5 years of Paris Agreement. And if we see the Paris Agreement, nationally determined contribution, what we call in short NDC, is actually the key tool for the implementation of the long-term temperature goal, which is 1.5 degree, and if possible, it's up to 2 degree. So as many of we are lawyer here, so NDC is actually, if I'm not very wrong, this is one of the main tools which gives a binding obligation to the parties. They need to submit it, they need to prepare and maintain it successively throughout the term of this implementation of the Paris Agreement. And in this NDC, they actually need to submit their ambition. They need to take a pledge that how much they want to reduce within their territory, especially how much they want to reduce their greenhouse gas emission. So this is a kind of a document that parties need to submit in the UNFCCC. And by submitting that document, it's a kind of a bottom-up pledge from the countryside that they're by submitting this, they are actually make a bold step that, yes, I'm going to reduce that percent. It can be 5, 10, it's entirely up to them. So I would like to briefly touch upon what are the shortcomings and how we can actually improve the implementation of NDCs. So the first thing, as I said, like it is a legally binding obligation, but it's very much depends on the party. As I said, like it's a bottom-up pledge approach. So it's entirely on the discretion of the parties that how much target they are going to take and how they are implementing it. In fact, in their NDC, they need to literally spell it out that what are the actions they are going to take to reduce their NDCs. So as it is a very much a bottom-up approach and it depends on the parties and their capacity, it's a very much discretionary and flexible things. And even the application of CBDR principle is very much depends on the respective capacity. Now, let's move on how we can improve it. So the Paris Agreement itself actually provided the implementation process through Article 13, 14, and 15. But I would like to focus on Article 15 actually, because this is where I'm working on. It talks about the compliance mechanism, and maybe many of you know that currently we are actually developing the draft rules of procedure for the compliance mechanism. So I would strongly suggest to develop the mechanism in a way so that in some way party feel themselves forced to actually implement their NDCs.
Thank you very much, Shara. I'm sorry. The next speaker is Stephen Leonard. He heads the Climate Justice Program based in Australia. He'll be joining us from Indonesia. And what I should also say is that if you have any questions, requests for clarifications, please put them in the chat. That's for all the participants. Use the chat function. Over to Steve.
Thanks, Christoph. So the issue that I'll be speaking about today concerns the relationship between human rights, an increasing emphasis on forests and ecosystems to solve the climate crisis, and how this relates to current negotiations concerning Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. First and foremost, it's critical for the implementation of the Paris Agreement and achievement of the 1.5 goal to phase out fossil fuels. So this means urgently phasing out oil, coal, and gas. However, what we're seeing is more and more of an emphasis on how to use nature to offset ongoing fossil fuel emissions in order to achieve net zero targets. It's been made clear since the UK was identified as the incoming COP presidency that nature is going to be high on the agenda as part of the outcome for COP26. We're also seeing an increase in announcements from industry concerning offsetting, linked with so-called nature-based solutions to achieve net zero targets and carbon neutrality. Whilst achieving net zero and moving towards negative emissions is of huge importance, there are major concerns that net zero targets in nature are being used as a smokescreen for business as usual for high polluting industries and countries. Some companies in the fossil fuel industry are representing themselves as climate leaders by putting in place relatively small, tokenistic, nature-based offsetting projects, which misleads the public into thinking that they're taking action on climate change. This dependence on nature and so-called nature-based solutions agenda is now being increasingly driven by the UNFCCC. The UK COP presidency has made it clear that an outcome on Article 6 is also a priority for Glasgow. Nature and the role of forests and ecosystems in the context of Article 6 carbon markets was a major stumbling block at COP25 last year in Madrid. A number of issues related to nature and Article 6 were unresolved in Madrid, such as how to ensure permanence of biological emissions reductions and how to ensure emissions reductions achieved through forests are not reversed in the future through deforestation and fires, and how to ensure no violations of human rights occur as a result of Article 6 project or program implementation. What we witnessed towards the end of Article 6 negotiations in Madrid cannot be accepted at COP26. The final text in Madrid included no reference to human rights. It was the rights of forest-dependent Indigenous peoples that became the compromise to make way for a global carbon market. For many years, concerns have been raised in relation to human rights violations and carbon projects under the Clean Development Mechanism and REDD+. In coming years, we'll be confronted with the same issues related to Article 6. Human rights against environment and forest offenders and violations are an all-time high, and there needs to be text included in the Article 6 decision to ensure there are no possible violations of human rights in its implementation. No decision on Article 6 carbon markets in Glasgow would be a better outcome than one that has any potential to cause harm to those most vulnerable to climate change. Thank you. And I think I made it in time.
Perfect timing. Thank you very much. We go from one part of the world to another now, to Colombia, where Giannina Santiago Cabacas will be joining us. She is one of the coordinators in the ILAC support unit. ILAC, that stands for Association for Independent Latin American and Caribbean States. But I have to make it very clear, and that also applies to all the other speakers. You're making these statements in your personal capacity. They cannot be attributed to any groups. And I'm glad you're joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. My son was born January 15th, 2015. He is 5 years old, just like the Paris Agreement, and he was born that very year. And I was working on these negotiations towards the adoption of the agreement. And of course, it goes without saying that I spent a lot of that first year of his life away from him. And I think it was worth it. And I still think it's worth it because this is an issue that will very much affect him and that younger generation. And despite the setbacks and pressure that this process faces, I think it's the best I can do for him and his sister. So it goes without saying that this is a very personal issue, not just a line of work and a challenge that we all faced. I chose to reflect today on the relationship between long-term planning and short-term action. And I thought about all the intelligent things that I could say in a manner in which the Paris Agreement legally is crafted so that the implementation very clearly articulates short-term action with that long-term goal under Article 2, and how NDCs must and should relate to long-term strategies. And in all these discussions, I've always felt that there's an elephant in the room in which that 1.5 no overshoot is not just this technical jargon, but the latest interpretation of that Article 2 of the Convention in light of how the best available science tells us we must implement climate action today. The greatest danger that we face as a legal community is that we fail to see the forest for all the trees that are in it. And there is a systemic big picture threat, which will potentially compromise the agreement and its ability to deliver our inability to align national action with the global needs. That is the biggest issue in the broader picture. And we as lawyers must face and say something about it. The spirit of the law is just as important as the letter of the law. To think that a should is more important than a shall misses the point, the big picture point of that cathedral that the Paris Agreement is supposed to be about. Implementation in the short term commitments are about foresight. And we can't make the mistake of what we have to do be detriment of what we have to achieve. Short-term action in NDCs, the ones that are to be updated this very year, are simply worthless if they're not part of a long-term story. And science has told us what we have to achieve and that it calls for all parties to revise substantially their short-term ambition. There is an ambition deficit, a gap between what we are to achieve in the NDCs, but yes, a gap in what those NDCs deliver in light of that 1.5 goal. A quote says that it is a foolish man who builds his house upon the sand. And just as I want the Paris Agreement to deliver on 1.5, I want my son to grow to become a good man. And I cannot pretend that he will be so if I don't lay the foundations for that now, if I don't educate him to do that now. And how can we pretend that Paris is to deliver in the long term, to be good and to deliver on 1.5, if we don't lay that short-term foundation today? And that's my thoughts for today.
Thank you very much. Now we're moving a bit further north to Mike Berger, who is the Executive Director of the Sabine Center for Climate Change Law. The virtual floor is yours, Mike.
Great. Thank you so much, Christoph. It's a pleasure to be here with all of these great panelists from all around the world. So it's a bit odd as an American to be talking at this event. The US has spent most of the life of the Paris Agreement withdrawing from it as a nation at the federal level. And that the thought that brings to my mind then is that much of the success of the Paris Agreement, yes, will depend on international coordination and the international regimes set up by and through and in addition to the Paris Agreement, but primarily on domestic implementation. And this is the way that the planet can achieve the 1.5 degree temperature goal. As has been mentioned, the agreement depends on a bottom-up approach, and this means that domestic constituencies are going to be a driving force for success, and they can drive implementation. In the last 4 years, during the Trump administration in the United States, we have seen a complete and total abdication of leadership at the national level. But we haven't seen but the vacuum has been filled, right? The void in leadership has been filled to a large extent by subnational governments acting at the state and the city level, by corporate leadership from some of the most powerful corporations on the planet, and from innovation in both technology and in policy that is driving the price of the energy transition lower and lower. Civil society throughout is the driving force, and through their litigation and through their advocacy, they're driving governments at all levels and corporations to achieve or to move towards achievement of the Paris goals. So on this note, I would and I'll close out by talking a little bit about climate litigation and the role that lawyers specifically can play as litigators, forcing implementation at the national level. We have seen this time and again. Lawsuits are popping up all around the world from civil society groups, from subnational governments, seeking to hold governments and companies to task. And sometimes this involves forcing assessment of climate change impacts, forcing assessment of the impact of projects or policies on climate change, or trying to seek to force governments to actually comply with the commitments that they voluntarily made through the Paris Agreement, through national legislation and through policy. So there's a very direct way that lawyers will play a critical role in achievement of the Paris goals, and that's through suing the bastards, taking them to court. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. From the US, we'll be moving on to Cameroon. Augustine Yamshi will be joining us. He is one of the co-founders of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and I think now the chair of one of their political committees. Augustine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I'm glad to see all of you. And I'm talking from Cameroon in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is already affecting our people. Loss and damage is already happening. I wake up every day and I see these women who are struggling on their farms to grow crops, to feed their families and to sell some. But at the end of the day, they don't harvest what they have planted because the rains came and went and never came back. And they are not sure about the next tomorrow. COVID-19 has even compounded the situation, made it such a difficult situation that they don't know what to do. I'm sure the question they ask themselves is, what did we do to deserve all of this? And that is what we call the fundamental injustices that are here on earth, because those who are suffering from this climate impacts have done nothing, little or nothing to contribute to it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is all universally acknowledged that the North has been plundering Mother Earth as if there is no tomorrow. And then the people that are suffering have not been able to cope even with the consequences. Looking at this, has there ever been any apology from the North or the companies that are doing all of this? Has there ever been any recognition of the gravity of the past and even present actions of the Northern countries? I think this is an opportunity for the UK presidency to bring a dialogue as part of the COP, either formally within the UNFCCC or outside of it, for people to simply come and acknowledge the past injustices. We have to forge the future. We must look at the past and see where we went wrong. Not to, to condemn people, but at least to render some justices so that we will build the kind of trust that is needed to forge the way forward. The UK, if the UK provides such a global leadership, it will change the cards on the table for all of these climate negotiations that we've had for the last 3 decades. And in doing this, the UK does not really need to, at all costs, to accommodate the US. We know the US is going to come back now into the Paris Agreement. That is good news. But let us not allow that to dominate the COP26. Let the UK stand alone and say we want to let the world go in a different direction. The world that is based on trust, the world that is based on empathy, the world that everybody cares for every other person. And then if we do that, if the UK does that, it will bring the necessary trust and bring back the lost confidence that we have had in the climate negotiations for over the past years. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Augustine. And now we are coming to Dennis van Werkel. Dennis is the legal counsel of Uganda. The Uganda Foundation, along with many Dutch citizens, successfully took the Dutch government to court and forced them to increase their greenhouse gas emission reduction target. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you, Christoph. And it's a real pleasure to be in the company of so many eminent speakers here on this panel that are raising all these important issues. And I wanted to touch upon 2 issues that were already addressed by some of the previous speakers, and that is, what is the level of emissions, what is the level of ambition that countries put in their NDCs and how much they're going to reduce their emissions. And yes, those NDCs and those emission reductions are a bottom-up process. But we must not forget that what lies at the core and what must lie at the core of the implementation of the Paris Agreement by its member states is equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. And that those efforts, those NDCs, although they are determined in a bottom-up process, must still comply with these very important principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. But how do we know when a country is setting its target that it is in fact in line with these principles? And how can civil society know whether what their country is doing is in fact in line with these with equity and common but differentiated responsibilities? They need to put the pressure on their government and hold them to account before the actual target is set. Because if we allow the process just to set inadequate targets and then to wait for those targets to have to be increased in 5 years, we will be too late. So what we need is an independent group of experts that looks at all the different interpretations of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and set benchmarks against which we can assess whether countries are really doing what they have to be doing, what they should be doing, and what they can be doing. And then we can have a true bottom-up process, setting the level of NDCs that are in line with equity and common differentiated responsibilities that are so essential for the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much, Dennis. When I put this initial list of speakers together, I tried to cover all the continents, and so far we've heard from 6 different continents. But I was struggling to find somebody who was somehow affiliated with Antarctica. And so I'm super happy that I can give the floor to Hitomi Kimura in Japan, who teaches at Usuma Women's University and has worked and published extensively on Antarctica, and in particular the Antarctic Treaty System. It is now 11:30 at night in Japan, so I'm extremely grateful you're joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Good evening from Tokyo. And I would like to talk about the role of the youth and future generation in achieving zero emission or carbon neutral, which both will be highlighted as the key drivers to implement the Paris Agreement at COP26. These two issues seem different, but are deeply related, simply because the younger, as they live longer, and the stronger they feel the real threat or risk of climate change. And the youth started to walk on the streets, insisting climate justice to cope with the current climate crisis. And the world also started to hear the voices of the youth as one of the crucial non-state actors. These bottom-up actions by the current younger generations for their own future or their future generations have been out of the traditional scope of intergenerational equity, which is also mentioned as the objective of the Climate Convention to protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity. Aligned with the climate justice, respect of intergenerational equity is also mentioned by the Paris Agreement, that it is currently limited as moral but not yet has been developed as legally effective norm. Intergenerational equity has been protected by adults who have a voting right under the democratic system to represent children's rights. However, the direct action by the youth revealed that this current system and the norm needs reconsideration in theory and practice. We also recall that this youth initiative led to the breakthrough of the Green Party in the European Parliament election. Climate litigation by the youth also touches upon the intergenerational equity or climate justice. At the occasion of the UN Climate Summit, more than 4 million children participated in the Global Climate March. And the children, including the Greta Thunberg, with assistance from the international law firm or environmental law NGO, submitted a legal complaint to denounce the lack of action by the government to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. These youth actions also accelerated the country's decision to upgrade their long-term emission reduction to carbon neutrality by 2050. This movement also led to the global wave of Fridays for Future, including Asia. In Japan, Prime Minister Suga recently declared carbon neutrality by 2050, including phasing out of the insufficient coal power plant and establishment of around $20 billion fund to create jobs and boost the economy hit by the COVID-19. This Japanese establishment ran about $20 billion fund to create jobs, boost the economy hit by the COVID-19. This Green Deal recovery includes innovative technology and so on. So let's hear the voices of the youth to achieve the carbon neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today is UN Human Rights Day. So we'll be hearing from Monica Feria-Tinta, a barrister at 20 Essex Chambers here in London next. Monica.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for the opportunity to share some thoughts. Certainly, the Paris Agreement doesn't contain any provision relating to human rights. However, the preamble has made it very clear that it is one of the objects and purposes of the treaty, of the Paris Agreement, acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humankind, and parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider the respective obligations on human rights, including the right to health, intergenerational equity, which we have just heard about, and considering the situation of vulnerable people. Now, the human rights organs widely have taken up that specific issue. And today there is an acknowledgement that human rights, that climate change is a human rights issue. I'd like to point out strongly that lawyers, the legal community, has now the challenge to assist domestically to make sure that there are remedies available for climate change impacting human rights in all jurisdictions. And I like to highlight that the 5 UN treaty bodies recently, in September 2019, had a joint statement. I just would like to read one of the specific state obligations that was highlighted there. And it was in particular the failure to take measures to prevent foreseeable human rights harm caused by climate change, or to regulate activities contributing to such harm, could constitute a violation of a state's human rights obligations. And by regulating activities, that includes private actors, including by holding them accountable for harm they generate both domestically and extraterritorially. So this really is, of course, at the international level, already these treaty bodies are looking into the obligations of a state, scrutinizing them both in the context of litigation and non-contagious proceedings. However, international law is always the last resort, and the main duty of lawyers at present of the community is to make sure that the adequate, based on adequate legal system to deal with these obligations in all domestic jurisdictions. So this is where action is being called upon, and legal minds have to be active about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, I give the floor to Megan Bowman. Megan Bowman teaches at King's College University, where she's also the director of the Climate Law and Governance Center. Megan, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and to LRI for organising this important event. So I want to focus on finance, and the reason for doing that is that finance is key to incentivising and accelerating most all the other strategic areas to implement the Paris Agreement and move to net zero. It's also the crucial next step out of the current COVID crisis regarding recovery and creating a new normal, one that's sustainable and equitable. Indeed, I think one of the key learnings about the climate crisis from the current chaos and tragedy is that we need to better comprehend and act upon systemic risk warnings. And when we look at the risks and impacts from climate change, they really make the COVID repercussions look preschool. So when considering priority issues for the Paris Agreement to succeed, specifically during COP26, we need to keep finance and systemic risk front and centre. Fortunately, this is language that the finance sector understands well. It's clear that in a COVID impacted world, we have less liquidity for dealing with a disorderly transition to net zero, and that's going to arise if climate-related systemic risks are ignored or inadequately addressed. So arguably the Paris Agreement itself mandates this. There's an article in that agreement that's been largely overlooked so far, but it's going to be crucial in making the agreement work. And it's Article 2.1c. It's in the objective section of the Paris Agreement, obviously, and it says this: this agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by, and this is the important bit, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Article 2.1c is a call to action to ensure that all finance, including public spending, private investment, mainstream finance, not just niche ESG or environmental social governance activities, but all finance for all things is flowing in the same direction, namely towards green, sustainable and resilient development. So this means developing a mainstream sustainable finance system, not one where it's niche ESG versus everything else. In short, every financial decision, whether public or private sector, from here on needs to take account of climate change and the pathway to net zero in the context of sustainable development. So in conclusion, all decision makers need to take Article 2.1c as their North Star from here on. And that law already exists. We just need to bring it to life. With the UK as the current COP president, it has a unique opportunity to set the tone for courageous and ambitious action globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. The next speaker will be joining us from Trinidad and Tobago. Rowena Haynes works closely with the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, and the High Ambition Coalition in the climate negotiations, and she's also the senior legal advisor for climate analytics in Berlin. Over to you.
Thank you, Christoph. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. Definitely a pleasure to be included on this very distinguished panel. I'm here to speak to you about the science. Of course, I am a lawyer like all of you and not a scientist. So I would like to frame my remarks first of all in that context. There are three key messages I want to leave with you today. The first is that science can capture the imagination and spur global action on climate change. The second is that the science continues to evolve, and this is something we must pay close attention to. And the third is that lawyers are part of the science policy interface, that architecture that is responsible for translating scientific conclusions and outcomes into policy relevant messages that are also capable of spurring action, domestic action on climate change. So on my first point, I want to reflect a little bit, looking at the journey, part of the journey of how we got to what we have now as what we understand as the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. From 2013 to 2015, a very little known process called the review of the long-term temperature goal was undertaken under the convention. This is coming out of 2009 from the Copenhagen Accord, where there was a reference to the need to review the well below 2 degrees Celsius goal. That review took place from 2013 to 2015. As part of the outcome, we had a structured expert dialogue that drew 10 conclusions. I want to draw your attention to 2 of those conclusions. The first is that a 2 degrees Celsius limit should be seen as a defense line. And the second was that while science on 1.5 degrees Celsius warming is less robust, efforts should be made to push the defense line as low as possible. These 2 conclusions that came out of the structured expert dialogue in 2015 form very much the basis for what we have now in Article 2 on the long-term temperature goal, and are also the basis for the call for the decision in 1CP21 for a special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius by the IPCC. We had a very spectacular fight in plenary in 2018 on that report that captured the imagination of the entire global public, and is also responsible for marches for science, and also responsible for incentivizing a lot of the youth activism that was previously spoken about. So I'll make 2 brief points. On the science continues to evolve. We understand that there are new models and more accurate science coming out, and I know I have to wrap up, but this is something that we do need to pay very close attention to, including in relation to the new or the second review of the long-term temperature goal that is beginning today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And once again, apologies for rushing you through your presentations. Next, I would like to give the floor to Selam Abebe. She works closely with the African group of negotiators in the climate change negotiations, and is also doing a PhD in Reading at the moment, where I think she's joining us from. Selam, over to you.
Thank you, and a pleasure also to be part of this panel, and thank you for the invitation. Following that presentation, I think it's really interesting to follow on the legal questions and consideration around the implementation of adaptation. As science have indicated, even with the current even if with the high level of mitigation that we are calling for, if that were to be achieved because of the already existing GHG emissions, there will be a lot of adverse impacts of climate change. So the question is, what can we do, and how can we frame the legal questions around that to implement adaptation better? Because we cannot separate the implementation of the PA cannot be achieved without an ambitious adaptation action. I'm sure all of you here would know the clear obligation. It started from the convention, where Article 2 provides the context of the needs for adaptation, Article 4.1b, where it calls on all parties to formulate, implement, and publish their adaptation efforts. Following that, there is also a clear obligation where developed country parties are required to support developing countries with their work or efforts on adaptation. Following that, the parties further provided clear guidance on adaptation and provided a clear goal. So when we can look on Article 2, where the long-term temperature goal is linked to less adaptation, increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. And we also have Article 3, where it recognized that adaptation could be a component of the nationally determined contribution of countries. Article 7 defined a global goal that's linked to progression, ambition, and also recognition of efforts by developing countries. Following that, around in 2016, when the UNFCCC did the synthesis report of the INDCs, around 137 countries have submitted adaptation as a component of their NDC. So with that, there is now a need under the GST to collectively assess that. So the question for COP26 would be, how can we operationalize the global goal for adaptation, recognizing that there is work under the AC? How can be that linked to methodologies of needs, because the different scenarios can present that? And also, do we need to quantify that goal as a temperature goal? And do we need a political space under the CME to advance the work? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure the next speaker needs much of an introduction. Farhana Yamin is the founder of Track Zero and was also the second on the BBC's Women's Hour Power List in 2020. Farhana, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with so many lawyers that I recognize, but thankfully so many new people that I don't know yet. It's coming up to my 30 years as an international negotiator, working for many of the small islands, for the LDCs, for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, working very closely with ILAC colleagues. So in my 3 minutes, 2.5 now, I want to give a few very headline messages of where I think as lawyers we can contribute best. One is 2030 is the new 2050. I was one of the chief champions and originators of the idea of the net zero goal by mid-century in the Paris Agreement. And it's wonderful to see so much progress being made. But frankly, the global north must advance that goal and pick up its fairer share, including for historic reasons, including for wealth reasons, including for technology reasons, and have 2030 as a nearer date for phasing out greenhouse gas emissions. The second big picture thing, which I think unites us, many on this call, is restoration of nature starts with registration and reparations. We are now seeing multiple crises, the biodiversity crisis, the nature crisis, the climate crisis, the social inequality crisis, and these result from deep roots of centuries of colonialism and centuries of genocide, centuries of ignoring the rights of indigenous people. Around 40 to 65% of the world's land is held collectively by indigenous people and local communities, and yet only 10% of it is recognized, and even fewer, even a smaller amount of it than the 10% is legally registered. And even when it is, it's ignored. So we as lawyers have to stand up for the human rights, for ownership of that. And so many decades have been spent with projects, especially by fossil fuel industries in particular, but also mining, ignoring those rights and extracting unjust rewards from wealth that belongs to others. I think the third major point that I personally want to make is that community is the new cop. So many of us have spent, you know, months, weeks. I've usually spent 2 or 3 months every week since 1991 at the COPs. We've neglected our own backyard, and we must make fresh bonds in order to have a kinder, greener, fairer society. And I think that we can. I've only got 2 minutes 43 on my clock. And the last thing I want to say is a message. Sometimes breaking the law, which is what I did in nonviolent direct action, is the most important things we lawyers can do. And I salute and applaud and want all of us as lawyers to support those of us who are prepared to do that. And the 2 lawyers who are in the House of Parliament Square, just last sentence, are Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, you know, and in the middle is Melissa Fawcett, and all of them achieved the massive changes that they did by taking non-violent direct action and choosing to break the law. So sometimes we need to be a bit more courageous. But thank you for inviting me to close this, and look forward to working with you in all of the different ways that us lawyers can.
Thank you very much, Farhana. And I have my 16-year-old daughter next to me who keeps time, so she's not corruptible, I promise. I think the last speaker on my list is Vusita Viyankayaya. Yaka, please correct me. Sorry, Vusita, who joins us from Sri Lanka. Over to you.
Hi, Christoph. It's all good. Pronouncing my surname, so it's all good. It's in good. I feel like I'm more of a practitioner these days than a lawyer, so I thought I'd focus on things on the ground, that the work that we do in developing countries that I thought should be highlighted. So a few issues that I would like to highlight as key aspects which we need to focus on going forward include thematic areas and actions related to loss and damage and addressing risk transfer. So this would connect with several other aspects which we relate to concerning vulnerable communities and vulnerable ecosystems, including, for example, the food systems and the food sector, which is a topic that I think in 2021 everyone will be focusing on more than now. So this is not just about 2021, but something we need to focus going long term as well. This includes vulnerable communities who are at the forefront of climate impacts, farmer communities, women, children, youth, and then risk transfer, risk finance plays a key role in resilience building and ensuring that vulnerabilities are addressed. And also that existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities are not exacerbated. And it is important that these actions that we take are inclusive and participatory, and also benefiting the people who really need them and not making them more vulnerable. So we have to be careful when we are talking about risk transfer and risk finance to make sure that the vulnerable communities are getting what they need and not making them more vulnerable. Among other aspects, I would also like to highlight human mobility, which also connects with loss and damage, as well as risks that we face. Migration and displacement play a key role. This could be directly visible or something connected to different dimensions that we focus on. It could have diverse factors which interlink with climate change impacts, risk, lacks and gaps in risk management and risk transfer, which induce vulnerable communities, for example, farmers, to move from one place to another temporarily or giving up their profession. So it is important that we connect the dots and address the larger picture in a holistic manner. So what can we do as lawyers or people contributing to policy processes? I believe it's important that we ensure the laws and policies on climate action are evidence-based. I remember someone else highlighting this as well. And also based on ground level risks and vulnerabilities, it is important that we integrate these concepts to the policy processes at national and global level. So some of these ongoing processes, which we already discussed, I'll just quickly refer, like the NDC review process, national adaptation plans, as well as the national and global development processes, which are good entry points for us. For example, the sustainable development goals and the targets that are being localized in many countries, and how these could connect to the Paris Agreement and the actions. So through an integrated approach to ensure that we do our best to contribute to address the needs of the most vulnerable, I think we can do a good job, and hope this is something we can achieve through the contribution of all lawyers and policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fusita. And I apologize not only for struggling to pronounce your name correctly, but also for failing to introduce you properly. You are, of course, the Chief Executive of the Saiken Trust in Sri Lanka, and you've been the whole Sri Lankan delegation on a few occasions in these climate negotiations. So thank you all very much for your contributions. I was hoping to find a couple of questions in the chat, but because there aren't any, maybe I can ask the other participants in this meeting who have not spoken yet to raise questions of clarification maybe, or just make additional comments. Are there, for instance, any areas that we have not covered yet? Maybe you could just raise your hand.
Christoph, there is a question from Linda Sigel. And actually it probably goes to a couple of people on the panel. So.
Brilliant. So maybe Linda, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Christoph. I wasn't expecting to take the floor. I just wanted to ask a question in the chat, and I know we're running out of time. I'm hoping everyone can read my question, but it's around loss and damage. And I thank Augustine for his impassioned plea to the UK and other developed countries to make an apology certainly for historical emissions that are causing damage now. And my question is quite legalistic. It's around paragraph 51. I said article 51. It's paragraph 51 of decision 1CP21, which kind of has worked to elide liability and compensation outside the loss and damage contemplations under the Paris Agreement. And, you know, given this brain trust that we have here, what ideas you all might have in respect of ways to get around that clause, and the arenas or fora that we can use to do that. Thank you.
Are there any? I see Richard Lord has raised his hand.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, just jumping in very quickly. Litigation is obviously a blunt instrument, but it often is necessary. So I just say that there's quite a lot of stuff out there about looking at litigation, and we at Action for Justice have just published a climate litigation guide, which you might find useful for that. So I'm not trying, Christoph, to be self-public, but I hope it might be helpful. That's just my brief suggestion as one, but the panel may have better ones.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Monica, I also saw your hand was raised.
Yes, I mean, there are already examples of litigation that is basically addressing issues of loss and damage, and that is very much in the context of civil proceedings. We have seen the current German case concerning the Peruvian farmer affected by private, alleging harm as a consequence of specific private actor emissions. And although in international law, most of the contentious cases have been focusing on mitigation and adaptation measures at a bilateralized level of a dispute, you know, it may well be, you know, if it is a correct case, so to say, that raises specific issues of loss and damage, you know, it could also arise in the context of international litigation. So, in other words, you have, you know, civil suits as a possibility domestically, and possibly also international legal suits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Farhana wanted to say something. Is that otherwise? Maybe you could just raise your hands in the chat. Then I know who else might want to comment, respond, make an additional point.
So I wanted to highlight the concept of ecocide. You know, it's one of the concepts which Polly Higgins, and in the last couple of years has got a lot of traction and is being discussed more and more. And frankly, irrespective of whether you think, putting it as an extra crime in the International Criminal Court is the right route or some other route is, and there is a panel tomorrow that is going to discuss this. But I think as lawyers, we've not used criminal law in the fullest way that we want to. Most of us are not from the criminal world. We are, public international lawyers, or have concentrated on suing a litigation through civil based remedies. So I really wanted to highlight that to Linda, especially because I feel that's a much more fruitful and frankly more potent weapon. And it's the reason why I glued myself to the headquarters of Shell this time last year. So I think we've got to throw all legal tools, all legal disciplines at the rest. And I think that criminal liability will flow from the conclusion of some of the cases that are going on when did Shell know, when did Exxon know. So I think as soon as those cases have concluded, that will be very fertile ground for actually then taking the next step and holding them accountable through legal channels. Thank you.
Maybe Salam next, and then Augustine, please.
Thank you. Maybe this is not a direct answer, but also another consideration of how we can see liability. As Linda said, paragraph 51 clearly says that there will not be a consideration of liability under this agreement. But the consideration of liability for loss and damage first was recognized in the convention itself as the adverse impacts of climate change that lead to damage would have a component of liability and compensation. So as we also have that consideration under the convention, so that could be one way of looking at it. And I note that most of CITES countries, when they have ratified the PA, they have provide an exception to paragraph 51. So I still think there will be possible ways in which we can entertain this under the UNFCCC. Thank you.
Augustine.
Yeah, thank you. I brought the issue of kind of dialogue for people to recognize the past issues that they did to contribute to this problem. Not just because we need to punish people, but for us to recognize that this problem, the source of this problem is none. If we have to recognize that, it will help the Paris Agreement move ahead, because we cannot just be futuristic. If we are futuristic, forgetting what has happened in the past, first of all, we lose confidence in the talks, as there's no confidence, there's minimal confidence even in these climate negotiations. Looking at something like finance, the Article 9 of the Paris Agreement is very clear. Developed countries have to provide the finances. Other parties are encouraged to do so. And then the finances have to be predictable and additional. The finances have to meet the needs and the priorities of developing countries. All of those things are there in the Paris Agreement. But when you look at the negotiations, it is like developing countries are begging for finances to cope with climate change, especially for adaptation. So if we come together as a people and say we went wrong somewhere, and these are the consequences, some people are suffering from that problem, and we must right the wrongs before going ahead, that will help the negotiations. And that is why I was calling on the UK to take the lead, because they will break away from the tradition of this suspicion, this cat and mouse kind of negotiations that we're having. And this will really be very helpful. So it is not just apology, but building confidence, looking at where we came from. Because unfortunately, Chris, since Copenhagen, it's as if the world is forgetting that there's a differentiation between those who have not caused the problem and those who have caused the problem. We're not necessarily blaming them or to put them in jail, but we have to recognize that in a very official manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Augustine. Monica, is that an old hand, or would you like to come in again? Okay, so I don't actually have any more requests for the floor. And in that case,
we have one more question in the chat if anyone would like to address it. Or
it is specifically to Megan. Megan, have you seen the question? It says, given the high level of perceived risk in investment, what can lawyers do to provide mechanisms to address this?
Oh, gosh. How long have I got, Christoph, before you hoot me off? Don't answer. All right, Holger, fantastic. Olga, thank you so much for the question. I want to say, gosh, so much. The first thing I want to say is, Augustine, you're on the money, my friend. There is such a gap between what is stated in the Paris Agreement and what is currently being delivered. There is such a gap between what is, the 100, the thresholds, the basic minimalist thresholds that have been promised, and the actual financial needs of what I mean, we're talking the difference between sort of millions, billions, and trillions of what is required, and there is a massive deficit of trust. And I hear that, and I'm not even close, I wouldn't say, to COP negotiations, but I hear it from people who are that this trust deficit between developing and developed countries must be bridged for us to move forward. So I thank you, Augustine, for raising all of that. To quickly answer Olga's question, yes, you are absolutely right. Huge perceived risk. And also, of course, adaptation is a problem because it doesn't give any immediate financial rewards. Mitigation, at least, particularly renewable energy is now on par, and you can make a buck out of it. So it makes sense. Adaptation makes less sense financially, and there are very high levels of perceived risk in investment in developing countries. And perception to markets is everything, because markets are psychological and emotional, believe it or not, even though we believe they are something else, more static. They're not. So how to do this quickly? So lawyers, I think, one of the things really is with government mechanisms in relation to incentivizing investment and also disincentivizing fossil fuel related products. So, for example, incentivizing investment is through pricing things appropriately, pricing carbon risk appropriately, and also pricing opportunities appropriately. That can really help. But then you have additional instruments through insurance and guarantees and so forth that actually can bridge that gap between what looks really sort of unfeasible and what could actually work and make a buck. That's where you need governments to step in. So it's less lawyers and more governments. But I think it's up to lawyers to kind of educate themselves about these different levers that we can pull and to get in on these discussions at the policymaking government level. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for your contributions. We will write this up in a concise report, circulated, and you'll get an opportunity to comment again. And then maybe ultimately this is a contribution to trust building and goodwill in the future. I would hand over to Robert Lord Carnwath now to close our meeting officially. Thank you all very much. Stay safe, and I hope I see you in person next year.
Well, thank you, Christoph. I feel sort of rather inadequate at this stage. There's been so much ground covered by people who know so much more about it at the practical level than I do. I mean, I thought the overriding theme was really set by Augustine from the Cameroon, saying that really it's up to the North to step up to its responsibilities for what it's done in the past. And also, I think a number of people emphasize that this is a big opportunity for my country, the UK, to take a lead in the both sort of setting the legal framework and the policy framework and the ambition, but also, as was emphasized, trying to ensure that the we live up to our commitments in terms of financing, which of course have been a major issue. And one of the most encouraging things was to see Michael Berger here in a capacity which bears some relationship to what his government, we hope, is now going to be. And so that is certainly one of the pluses. And I hope that, while I hope my country will be able to provide a lead, we can stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States, as we should be doing and in the past did. I'm less sure about Farhan's suggestion that illegal action is the way forward. I'm very conscious that in the Supreme Court in the UK, we look down on Westminster Square and we have those marvelous figures of Gandhi, Mandela and Millicent Fawcett to represent what can be achieved by peaceful action outside the law. But I hope that with our great tradition of law and the rule of law, we'll be able to ensure that there is an adequate framework to achieve these things without the need for such unlawful action. We had the Extinction Rebellion demonstrating outside our court, and I must say they didn't help to highlight action, but I think we as lawyers have somehow got to ensure that the legal community provides a proper legal framework. And but there are so many other points that have been covered. I think perhaps the final note is Janina's 5-year-old son, who sort of provided a nice symbol of what it's all about, which is future generations. And I hope he will watch with optimism as he gets older, and that we are actually living up to all the things we're trying to do now. So thank you all very much. Thanks for allowing me to listen in, and I look forward very much to seeing the notes of what's been said. And goodbye to you all.